Good evening, everyone. My name is John Frank, and I'm the Vice President for European Government Affairs at Microsoft. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening for a discussion on an important topic. I recognize a lot of the faces here tonight, and some new faces, which I'll recognize soon enough. As we talk about artificial intelligence and AI and ethics, the specific issues that come up do deserve attention. And this is one that we've been talking about for about a year now, that facial recognition is an incredibly powerful technology, and yet it can be used in improper ways. Not necessarily intentionally, but knowing the limits and the proper uses for technology is especially important. And so tonight's discussion will focus on artificial intelligence. And it's great to partner with Euractiv for this evening's event. And we'll turn it over to Brian, who will lead this evening's discussion. So welcome, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, John. Welcome to all of you. We always appreciate the time that you take to be here at these events. This is the most subscribed event from the Presidency Series which we've had to date, so we expect a lot of audience participation with your questions later on in the panel. Let's do some housekeeping first. Your phones on silent if you will, but please feel free to tweet about this as well. The hashtag tonight is hashtag EA Debates, Euractiv Debates, photographs and comments, and we'll try and retweet those for you, and you can tag Euractiv directly in that too. Our panel, if I can ask them to come and take their seats as well, distinguished panel, and we tried to put together a mix of different perspectives for you this evening. We have tried, and I must say it was complete integrity, we tried to make a better gender balance for this evening. We need to do better on this. I said to Cornelia earlier that it was only fair that we had 4 men to match her intellect as well. So we think there's a fair balance, more or less. Let me introduce our panelists this evening. Beside me here is Doro Peter Francesco. He's a member of the European AI Alliance. Besides is Christian de Cunha. He's the head of the private office of Giovanni Buttarelli. He's the European Data Protection Supervisor. Then we have Guillermo Beltra. He's policy director at Access Now. And there's absolutely no artificial intelligence with this participant tonight. Cornelia Couturer, she's the Senior Director of the EU Government Affairs here at Microsoft. And finally, Jos van Hoeboken, he's the Professor of Law and Chair of Fundamental Rights and Digital Transformation at VUB. He's also substantially jet-lagged, if you would be kind to him this evening. He's just returned from Seattle, which we'll hear about a bit later on. We want to start with the 60-second opener from each of our panelists, and just who they are, what they do, and their elevator pitch for this subject. So, Doro Peter.
Yes, good evening, everybody. So, I have a background in political science and information technology. Some of you here may know me from a different role, that was head of one of the leading Brussels-based think tanks that looks into the work of the European institutions, in particular that of the Parliament and the Council. And the way we do that, as some of you know, is also by using a lot of, maybe not necessarily artificial intelligence, but we do use automated processes to process millions and millions of pieces of political data, which also brings me here. This is not about facial recognition, what we're doing, but it is a lot about the recognition of the views of the people that are leading this continent. My message tonight will be about the need to strengthen what I think is the Europeans' competitive advantage in the race for artificial intelligence, in the global race, and that I think it is its citizenry and its usership base, which, if it is properly educated, can become a big contributor and an advantage, and not an obstacle if it is, which it could become an obstacle if it is too concerned about the use of artificial intelligence and its private data. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian.
Thanks, Brian, and thank you for the invitation. It's good to be here. I work for a supervisory authority in the area of data protection. So we supervise what EU bodies do with personal information. We're a member of the European Data Protection Board. We're also quite active in the policy space, and one of the things that we've been doing in the last few years is trying to develop and provoke a debate on digital ethics. And facial recognition is one of the emerging technologies that we're following very closely. I suppose my main message is it's more of a series of questions, which is, what is facial recognition for? Who do we really need it? Who benefits from it? Do the benefits outweigh the harms? Is it sustainable? And first of all, we need to discuss whether to have it before we discuss how. So we don't have a democratic consensus on the development and application of facial recognition, and when we do, that will be the time to discuss how to regulate it.
Thank you, Guillermo.
Good evening, thank you. First of all, thank you to Euractiv and to Microsoft for inviting Access Now. For those of you who might know us yet, Access Now is a global digital rights NGO. So we work across the world to defend and extend the digital rights of users at risk. And I highlight the at-risk bit because, as I will go more into later, the development and deployment of artificial intelligence is of particular concern for those users that are most at risk. The work we do is we provide direct technical support for users at risk around the world, to bloggers, to activists, to journalists that have their digital rights threatened. We provide comprehensive policy expertise to governments and companies around the world. We provide grassroots grant making, and we do convenings such as RightsCon, which is the largest digital rights conference, happens next week in Tunis. I hope I will see many of you there, and if not, maybe next year. Just a very high-level first thought, and I want to respond to the actual question in the panel description. Artificial intelligence, is it more than just ethics? Definitely. Our whole perspective here is that the starting point to understand the deployment of this technology and how we might build a governance model around it has to be human rights. These are technologies that they won't start threatening our human rights. They are already threatening our human rights and exacerbating unfair solutions. So for us, the starting point is human rights.
Thank you. Cornelia.
So my name is Cornelia Kutter. I'm Senior Director here in the Microsoft Brussels office, working with John on these issues such as facial recognition technologies, which, as he said, has been with us for the last year. And as he said, it's a powerful technology that brings a lot of good things and wonderful uses, but we are also aware of the risks companies that have been already spelled out here quite succinctly. So my role here is to evolve a little bit about what it means to be responsible here as a provider of those technologies. What is responsible AI for the service provider, for the user of these technologies, and what's the government role, where we do believe the government has a role to legislate.
Okay, thank you. Joris.
Hi, so thanks very much for the invitation. Indeed, I'm a little bit jet lagged, but hopefully I'll manage. So I want to mention one thing, I'm appointed to the chair of fundamental rights and the digital transformation, which is a chair at the Vrije Universiteit Brussels in the Law and Technology Society group, and this chair receives support from Microsoft. Fully independent as an academic, but I just want to make sure that I disclose this. Facial recognition is an incredible topic to teach. We just went through, at the VUB, through a case study with students on facial recognition in the public sector context, in the private sector context. And I mean, it really speaks to the imagination. So I think that's also maybe why we have a broader debate about AI through the lens of facial recognition technologies and the issues that it raises. I would say that from a European perspective, the European approach being of a more regulatory nature and fundamental rights value-based, I think we do see that there is a challenge to apply those higher level frameworks that have been developed. We have the GDPR, which is a higher level framework. it's applicable to facial recognition technologies in depending on the configuration, how it applies. And we have now the principles on AI at the EU level. But of course, it's really challenging to apply those principles, those high-level principles to specific cases. So that's, I think, a major challenge for the EU. The second point I wanted to make is the challenge around recognizing and tackling, addressing abuse. You know, like in particular because of the fact that facial recognition technologies nowadays are offered as cloud services that can be plugged into, you know, any kind of use case. So the question then really becomes, you know, what kind of responsibility is the facial recognition service going to take for particular use cases? And I mean, just to give an example of something that I used in my teaching, it could well be that like a media app, you know, here in Belgium from a large newspaper has some engineers going rogue and implement facial recognition to experiment with what kind of recommendations they can give, you know, using emotion detection on people using the app without properly even informing people, without the DPO knowing about it. You know, these kind of abuse cases, I think we're going to see more and more of them with the more like with facial recognition becoming more widespread. And I think that's a really key issue. Like, do we have the right frameworks to recognize the abuse, for people to realize that there may be abuse, for drawing the right boundaries between good use and abuse, and then for what responsibility do the various actors have?
Thank you. Christian, I want to come back to something you said earlier. Is it not too late to be asking the question, should we have it? Are we not beyond that stage yet, or do you think it's possible to rein back in this genie that slipped out of the bottle of AI and facial recognition?
Well, there's always a choice. People always have choices. We're not on a juggernaut without any means of changing direction or even stopping and thinking about it. It seems that, you know, I mentioned that there doesn't seem to be an ethical consensus or democratic consensus about the application of this technology, and yet it seems, as Joris was saying, it seems to be slowly creeping in by some sort of osmosis. And in my view, where there is a lack of consensus, the main driver tends to be money. And businesses will spot an opportunity because that's what they're there for in the market, and they will attempt to fill it. But in relation to facial recognition, what seems to be driving the design, development, and application of the technology seems to be two things. First of all, politics, and the fact that people are worried about borders, they're worried about crime on the streets. And this has intensified in recent years with massive sort of population displacements, which are predicted to get even worse with climate change. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is there's a sort of religion of convenience which has appeared, where it's just you know, isn't it more convenient to walk into a place and not have to produce documents in order to get access to it. And so, even one example I use is in Disneyland. You gain, if you're a season ticket holder, you gain access through facial recognition to the theme park. And you know, there's some nice things like Mickey Mouse will recognise your kid without having to ask its name. But you know, the enormous amount of biometrics are held on the magic band that you need to carry when you're walking around. So it's happening. And so the question is this sustainable? And it's poignant to have this discussion right now because it's 30 years since the Tiananmen Square massacre. Tiananmen Square is now a place where, if you're Chinese, to get access to it, you need to go through airport-style security. You need to have your face scanned and recognised. You need your EID scanned. And if there's any trace in the system of you being involved in dissident activity, then you're taken away. China is using this technology right now in order to repress whole swathes of non-Han populations. So this is the sort of this is what we need to face up to. That if I just wanted to mention briefly one quote from the biologist E.O. Wilson. He said that humanity's real problem is that it has Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. But actually, I would add something to that, which is that we think often that we have godlike technology. In actual fact, we're pretending, because the hype is sort of up here and the reality is quite a long way away. So you don't have autonomous cars which are able to change lanes on their own safely. You don't have robots that can open doors, turn door handles, and you don't have facial recognition which is fully accurate.
Okay. Thank you. I just want to ask Cornelia, we're going to talk a lot this evening, obviously, about a lot of the bad things that can happen with AI and facial recognition and why they need to be regulated, but there's a lot of good stuff as well. What do you see as the potential benefits of AI and facial recognition?
I mean, it's really a use case scenario, and you find with all technologies you have good users and bad users. So the convenience part is, for example, something that I think most users actually want, and often it's not identification; it's about the verification. So it's a one-to-one verification system. For example, when you cross borders, so you don't have to stand in the line, but can sort of swipe through that. There has been cases anecdotally in India, for example, where missing children have been found. You have security controls for workers in factories. So there is a lot of good uses that you can deploy that technology to it. And then there is really the question, so how do you actually implement like our vision in having an ethical and empathetic framework towards that? And sort of when you think about the empathy, that's of course where you need to guard against the abuses in those spaces. And I think there are a couple of things that need to be done. First of all, we look at the risks around AI in three buckets. One is privacy, and we can talk a little bit about GDPR and the law enforcement directive. Then there is bias and discrimination, which has a little bit to do with the technology itself and how accurate the technology is and how you actually guard in a process, in the governance of the development, but also the deployment of the technology. And we can talk a little bit about that too. And the last part is what I think Christian was alluding to is the bigger societal risk in the context of a surveillance state.
Okay.
And here we can sort of like run through these topics and how we should be addressing this.
Okay, Guillermo, the surveillance state, you would clearly have concerns about this. What worries you most?
So the thing we're seeing with already a lot of live AI systems up and running and special facial recognition technologies that are being used around the world is that there are too often used as a higher tech way of doing something that was already wrong. Like we're seeing examples of marginalized communities being followed or being monitored in their communities just because there are there might be communities with higher indexes of crime, or we are seeing, for example, while police shouldn't be using facial recognition technology to do positive IDing, they are using that and using it in a way that right now with the laws we have are not necessarily compatible.
And it wouldn't be so bad though if, perhaps you take the view, it wouldn't be so bad that if they actually got it right all the time. But there's a high level of failure involved in this as well.
Yes. Yes, so that was actually a point I wanted to come to later, is that we have to also be genuinely sincere about the difference between theory and practice. And what we're seeing time and again is that since latest data we had is 2018 different studies, we're getting accuracy rates of inaccuracy rates of 96 to 98% in many facial recognition technology systems. Doesn't mean that it will always be that way, but the question
just
shouldn't be...
Just context, in Wales, for example, is one study they did with this, and 2,000 people in one day were wrongly identified as being criminals.
Yes.
And
there you go.
The consequence of that is what?
I just, like, the error rate is 4% or like not 96%, otherwise I guess it wouldn't make sense to use the system, no?
Ooh. Yes.
So-
Okay. So but the failure rate is still
It's still significant.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that the margin of error is not particularly healthy.
No, we've seen reports with error rates of 96%. But
almost 100%.
yeah, but yeah,
30 congressmen who were wrongly identified, weren't they, as criminals recently
Maybe they weren't wrongly identified.
because of their colour.
Maybe the AI knows more than we do. Cornelia.
So maybe it's good to step back and think about what machine learning actually is doing in these cognitive services. It has the ability, because of the data, to match images and recognize them. This is exactly what the brain does too. And so the achievements and the breakthroughs have been able to be achieved through the data that is available. So it is a lot about how good the data is and in which context you're using it. But it's also to be recognized that it has actually achieved human parity. So it is as good as. That doesn't mean that it shouldn't be challenged. And we have been, for that specific reason, I mentioned bias and discrimination. There are a couple of ways you can actually address these issues. Let me point out to two of them. The first is when you deploy facial recognition technology, you should be able to understand what you are actually using. So, for example, third-party testing should be mandatory for these type of technologies. So the user, when a government or a company starts to deploy a specific technology for its use cases, can actually test the accuracy for that specific reason. So then we have, in order to address bias and discrimination, one way of doing this is to require what we call data sheets, that when you are developing the AI, that you are actually creating the respective data documentation. For European ears, you could think of a type of electronic components regulation that we know well. All our devices have these long sheets of specificities. Something like that could be helpful in this context. So you can actually start to address specific risks with actually tools that we are well aware of.
Let me put this, Joe. What's working in the framework so far, and where do you think the big gaps in framework and regulatory protection are going to be?
Well, that's a very big question. I think I would say that, also connecting to the remarks that were made earlier, so things are so use case specific. So one of the things that kind of stands out for me then in the current regulatory framework for the processing of personal data is the principle of purpose limitation. It's really that there's something happening, that can be legitimate, but it's constrained to this particular use case. And things start to become more problematic, and I think people are maybe rightfully worried if it's used maybe for beneficial purposes that they consent to, or they agree to, or they make sense also from a democratic perspective, and then suddenly that data ends up being used somewhere else, or it starts slipping. And I think that is, that's a key concern, and that's for me, it makes sense. We have these principles, and it's really about applying them. And another point I wanted to make is really about, what type of negotiation are you going to have with citizens, with consumers, And I think you see a whole range of different configurations here. You see areas where it's used in consumer services, and it's gonna be consent. You want people to consent to and know, they should be very well informed about what kind of new, potentially very intrusive technologies are being used and what they're being subjected to. Now you can have negotiations that are in the workplace. There are many workplaces that are maybe implementing these types of technologies, and you want to have some kind of discussion and negotiation with your employees around, is this a reasonable use for the deployment in your organization? And then we have, of course, the use in more public sector areas. you know, where like I think it makes a lot of sense to have very robust discussions with citizens around, you know, is this a system that we want? You know, how can we really strike the right balance if we deploy some of these more like smart technologies in the public environment? Yeah, I want to just give one more example of the way that these kind of systems can go wrong. It's like there've been a number of reports coming out of the U.S. from Georgetown University describing like facial recognition issues, and you know, it's like once these systems are put in place, you know, there are all sorts of ways in which the system can be used in ways that like it was not meant to be like that way, you know, like so there's a recent report with some examples that are somewhat worrying, where police is using facial recognition system in the investigation space, and then they have a person that looks like an actor, you know, and then but they don't really have good imagery, but they can kind of see, the person looks a little bit like this famous person, and they grab a picture of the famous person and upload it into these facial recognition systems to try to see if they can get hits, and they start to use that further in the investigative process. You know, these are documented cases.
An agent thinks is a lookalike.
Yeah, so
just like an individual agent thinks you look like Tom Hanks. I'm just gonna. Yeah.
We're gonna
feed
feed a very good recognizable picture of Tom Hanks into the system, because I don't have a good like picture of the suspect. No, and then the use, you know, like I don't know what it's called in English exactly, but you know, like when witnesses describe the way like a suspect looks, and then you make this kind of graph, you know.
Mugshot.
No,
Mugshot.
not the mugshot. It's really like a drawing, like
Sketch.
the sketch. You know, and then feeding the sketch into the facial recognition system, you know, and see if you get hits. You know, and so that is it shows, like, I think there are a lot of reasons to pause with thinking like, hey, okay, there may be really good use cases, but do we have the right frameworks in place to think about the use?
Dora, I'm coming to you in a second. Cornelia, where are we in Europe in terms of our legislation? What's on the horizon for us at the moment that we need to be paying attention to? Is this just going to be an extension of GDPR and with some add-ons, or does GDPR already provide the bulk of the regulatory framework which we need for this?
Since we are going to have a new legislator, everybody will just have guesses here. And we have some hopes in this regard as well. So the high-level expert group on AI has put forward recommendations, principles, ethical principles. They have also specifically pointed to facial recognition, and have also developed some practical tools to actually use AI applications and or develop AI. So now we'll see the Commission has put this nice bridge towards the next Commission by piloting those assessment lists, and Microsoft, among many others, have committed to do this testing. And for us, this is a really good occasion to stress test, if you like, our own assessments and our own transparency models that we are deploying. So we have developed over the last year specific principles for facial recognition technology that we are now committed to deploy internally. Those, among other things, include also helping our customers to guide the deployment of facial recognition technology.
So it's fairness, transparency, accountability, non-discrimination, notice and consent, and lawful surveillance.
Yeah. Well, the lawful surveillance is we will advocate for the restrictive use of facial recognition technologies in that space. What we have recently come out with is a transparency note for the use of our own API, so Face API or Azure Cognitive Service. And it addresses a number of the issues that have been raised as being problematic. Like, for example, what do you do when people have twins, for example, or when they, as me, change their hair color from time to time in the glasses, and half of Brussels doesn't recognize me anymore.
I think guilty.
And so there is a process that the governance is actually a process for the deployment that we need. Now, coming back to your question on what we are going to see, I think there will be some recognition that GDPR is quite robust and addresses a number of the concerns, and we'll probably see in the course of the next years the compliance and enforcement of GDPR in these spaces. But there's also areas that it doesn't address at all, and this is sort of like this more, as I said, the third-party testing, the ability, the transparency obligations that it requires, the way in how you document the data that you have been using, or document how you deploy the technology in order to have afterwards a good ability to actually enforce rule of law.
Christian wanted to reply to this.
Well, just briefly, and I'm very proud of myself that I've lasted 25 minutes without mentioning GDPR. But the GDPR is a year old, and we're starting to see enforcement. There are some very relevant articles in the GDPR for this topic. There's a privacy by design obligation now, so that's about data minimization. That's about building systems from the beginning which have privacy in mind, and that may well lead to a conclusion that facial recognition is not an appropriate technology to develop at all. The second thing is that
would we end up, not to interrupt you, which I've just done, but would we end up in that case where Europe blocks itself out of global markets?
Well, it depends on. I go back to the point of, what's it there for? Is it liberating and empowering people, or is it just driving benefits to a few players? Is it creating a tool which is susceptible to malevolent actors?
Just to put in context, so for example, Netherlands has 800,000 criminal records and suspect records. And they used, in one study, they were able to identify 93 criminals using AI with that volume of data. Clearly this technology will advance, but that seems hugely disproportionate to me in terms of if you're balancing privacy with actual outcomes.
So you're saying that the technology is enabling more criminals to be identified?
Fewer in terms of the cost to our privacy and our democratic freedoms. Then perhaps, like you say, should we be using this? The Fundamental Rights Agency, for example, Fundamental Rights Agency lists AI as potentially capable of being misused and undermining our liberal democracies. I have no idea who they're talking about when they're talking about liberal democracies. But within Europe, we could see different countries, different member states, with a different application use of AI, or we could see an application like GDPR across the whole of the European Union, where Europe essentially becomes a safe space because we decide, like you say, that we don't actually want this. It's disproportionate.
I mean, the data protection in GDPR is basically saying that it's trying to facilitate data processing in a responsible way. And it tries to sort of protect the interests of people because basically you're deriving value from processing someone else's data, and so you have certain obligations. But it certainly doesn't put a block on technology. It doesn't put a block on progress. It simply tries to steer it into a responsible way. But the problem that we've got here, especially with AI, which is a kind of umbrella marketing slogan as far as I can tell, is that when people say that the technology is inaccurate, they're kind of asking you to accept the logic. Well, then you need more data, you need more surveillance and more data in order to perfect the imperfect algorithm, and that is, in our view, that's just not a sustainable position to hold.
Okay, Doro, your perception of where Europe is going to go with this?
Yeah, there are a number of points that I would like to address, and the first one is the accuracy of the technology. Listen, I think we had exactly the same kind of discussions 20, 30 years ago when we started using computers, and we were wondering how accurate they will be, how they will be able to process all sorts of information. I think it is not a question of whether these technologies will become more accurate. They will become more accurate, and there is the proof that they can have a very high rate of accuracy. It's that it already exists in other parts of the world. And that's how we have to look at this. And I'll come back to this in a moment. I think there is not a question of whether these technologies are capable of doing their job properly. They will become capable of doing their job properly. The question is obviously a different one, whether we should let them do the job properly. And this takes me to the second point that is, and something that has been also pointed in some of the recommendations of the Alliance for Artificial Intelligence, is the key element here is how we divide the roles and the responsibility between the humans and the machines. Who takes what decision? Because as we discussed, of course, there will be an infinity of examples in which this technology can go wrong, and that there will be wrong recognition and mistakes. But then the question is, okay, so when there is a mistake, what happens next? Is there a way for that person which is wrongly recognized to appeal to that, or does that person know that if he or she has been wrongly recognized? Is there a way to get things right? Or, because if there is, then that's fine. But if then the machine takes a decision based on the wrong recognition, then things become problematic, because nobody will be able to track where the mistake was done in that chain. So I think that's where we have to be careful on the division of the roles between the machine and one of the principles of the Alliance, one of the recommendations is that humans should always be kept responsible, and then that there is
responsible humans?
Someone at the end of the chain that should answer in case there is a mistake done.
Okay. Joe, so you've been writing a PhD here while we've been going along. What struck you during this conversation so far?
I think, I just want to make sure that everybody realizes that we're talking about a broad set of technologies, and facial recognition really being about faces and the processing of facial images. So it can be about identification, it can be used for authentication, it can also be used, let's say, more for profiling. An application like emotion detection is something where you're not interested in the identity of the person, but you're trying to categorize people. And so there, these uses also determine the types of challenges and the types of issues that you may have. With respect to the profiling and the categorization, I think this is also an area where we haven't really discussed it a lot yet, but where the discrimination concerns are really profound. Also, this is something. There's been quite a lot of work in the academic space since the 90s, really warning that some of these types of technologies can really further entrench and amplify existing
I just want
forms
to come to just to finish on that particular point. Are we losing our presumption of innocence?
Well, that's the point that you made earlier. So for a lot of these systems to work, they're kind of always on looking at everybody that passes by or everybody that uses the technology, and that's of course that's challenging privacy in the classic sense. It's like why if I'm innocent or if there's no good reason to do that, why do I become subject of that type of data processing? And I think there are some real concerns, and this is one of the reasons why yes, we have to there have to be really good reasons, and they have to be really well negotiated in the space where the technology is being applied.
So do we need a warrant type system where it should go before the bench and the warrant should be approved before the search begins? The data may be there, but accessing that data should be conducted in the same way that any other search would be done?
That's kind of like it depends really. So to say that depends on the application. Is it more in the law enforcement space or is it more in the commercial space? So then that's gonna impact the type of negotiation that you want to have with people around the application of these technologies.
Thank you, Cornelia.
Yeah, just to balance this a little bit out, for the abuses, and you warned me, we will hear a lot of the abuses, and I very clearly we don't want to disregard them, and I'll come back to the fundamental rights in a second, but just also to show the opportunities that the technology will provide. For example, we have a technology in our eye, which is a technology that is used for blind people so they can more actively participate in our social life, and for them precisely to be in a setting where they can recognize emotions of people they are sitting next to in conversations is of incredible importance. So they have suddenly a very, very different way of engaging with their environment around them. So that's I mean, Joris said it, that's the challenge. You find for all good uses, you find a negative use for which you can then say, oh, let's not use the technology at all. Now, where I would agree is we need to think, I actually think the development of the spaces is really important. We're really stuck with GDPR. I do believe we can actually deploy AI scenarios in a GDPR compliant way. We are doing this already. The GDPR is able to have wonderful safeguards, but there's areas where other human rights or fundamental rights of our charter, such as human dignity or the private sphere that Joris was mentioning, or non-discrimination, are other rights that we might want to think through a little bit more and look at whether these require secondary laws to reinforce them. And that is sort of the point that we were raising before.
Yeah.
When you think through these other fundamental rights, we can have a path forward with additional safeguards, such as I mentioned before.
Without going to the law enforcement side, so one of the technologies looks at genetic diseases using facial recognition AI. I think they've identified 200 genetic diseases which have a reasonable degree of prediction based on facial characteristics, which is fine and useful and positive. And if you thought you were at risk, maybe you want to use that. But then you have the insurance companies on the other side of that data as well, and being able to access that. And how do we negotiate that kind of quasi-consumer environment where your health insurance, your access to healthcare could be randomly determined at the supermarket as you do your scanning because you don't want to pay with a credit card on the way in?
Are you asking me?
I'm asking you if you
okay.
want.
So I have this specific issue with my driving ability and assurance that wanna know how I do. So joke aside, these are not really new questions. We have these questions in the context of assurance for many, many years. It's like, do we make a distinction between an 18-year-old driver and man and a 30-year-old woman? Because assurances try to do this produmentalizations because they look at the probability of risks, and of course with these technologies, the prediction becomes much more accurate. And then there is a discussion to have where will be the boundaries for the insurance companies to actually be able to do this, and where are the defense mechanisms for the user then in this context. But this is it goes back to the societal discussion that we need to have in a more scenario-specific case.
Guillermo, this isn't anything new then. So we have the tools available to deal with all these scenarios, yeah?
So,
That's not what I said.
I know it's not.
no, we don't know that yet, and that's the key thing. We are having, and not just we in terms of in Europe, but around the world, this conversation from an ethics perspective, at least in a political and legislative context. And while that works very nicely because we can kind of fish out all these use cases and examples and draw scenarios, we will never come up with a report that will be something meaningful that will then change, be enforceable, provide users with a remedy to go do something if they feel that something has gone wrong. So for us, the key thing is that we need to make sure that our laws and regulation are just up to speed with the new area, right? And Cornelia mentioned earlier the high-level expert group of the European Commission. One of our experts on AI, Fanny Hitpeje, she's a member, so she's following that work. What that group hasn't asked itself yet is exactly, are our laws, regulations, agencies, and enforcement mechanisms ready for this new revolution? And it's not just about the GDPR It's about, some have been mentioned, but it's safety law, liability law, consumer law.
Medieval institutions, as Christian was saying earlier.
Yeah, and well, maybe not medieval, but like kind of millennial laws, like late 90s, early 2000 laws that are maybe not ready for this, and we need to zoom in, look at them. And I'll link that to another question that you were asking, which is, I always kind of shrug my shoulders at the fact that is Europe gonna fall kind of behind because it's too much regulation or anything. I would flip that around and just ask ourselves, could Europe show global leadership, but actually coming with a sensible governance framework that works for its citizens, much like it has done with GDPR and data protection? At the beginning, the GDPR was going to kill the internet and it was going to stop all the economy and so on. What do we see today is a global debate about data protection in areas of the world where there was none before. Europe could do that again.
Do you think there's any debate in China? You think there's debate in China?
There's, of course, I mean, they're really starting to develop their own vision of what types of data protection frameworks they want to have. And it's like, but it's a very different one. It's like they also would, I mean, the message that I got at the conference that I attended was like, we know the Europeans have their way of doing it. We know the United States has their model of dealing with these things. We're, of course, going to have our own way of dealing with it. But there's a
You say that almost as though it could be a good thing.
No, I'm not. I mean, it's just a very logical outcome of, partly, of course, there's a lot of Chinese companies that want to operate globally and they want to be able to enter also European markets. So it's just not.
So do you see the market segmentation that we end up with a European bubble where we have some form of safe space for democratic values, freedom of association, for example? That's not going to fly in China. You know, identifying, if I'm seen with you in the street, facial recognition identifies both of us. I could look at all of you, not specifically you, George. You're not a bad guy. So
real significant concerns around the use of also these types of technologies in China, as like Christian was mentioning earlier. I mean, it's even, I think you can, my intuition is that China and the Chinese companies in this space, they're even maybe in some ways experimenting on their own kind of marginalized populations, deploying these technologies very aggressively to also kind of leverage that to sell these technologies in a global market. Now, and that's like from a global perspective, I think very worrying that are the strongest innovative opportunities for companies to develop. Are they in a space that are really like very problematic from a human rights perspective? You
so
know, that's
the
where
lower human rights threshold allows a faster rate of experimentation.
Yeah, going beyond, like just not care, like that's really the problem, where there's real value in experimenting with these kind of technologies in ways that are not human rights compliant, you know, and that becomes attractive, and then it becomes a race to the bottom, you know.
Yeah, I mean, we shouldn't. I don't agree with demonizing China. There is a. It's not a monolithic whole. It's an incredibly complex society, and there are enormous debates, you know, within the various levels of government and with companies, and in fact, like some people say that the cybersecurity law they have there is even stricter than the GDPR. But the crucial difference is that it only affects companies. Like there are no controls on what the state can do, and that's where, in a way, it's a kind of trying to compare GDPR with the data protection regime or human rights regime in China doesn't take us very far, because the structure of the state is completely different. I mean, I just wanted to just respond to some of these points by saying that you were asking, Brian, about what do we do. I mean, it may be that there are certain technologies which are which require licensing. So you recognize that they're risky, and so you're very careful about where they're applied. You don't put a blanket ban forever. Although you might want to suspend things for a while, like they've done in some parts of the US. But the reason for that is that, I mean, if you look at in the physical world, physical products, like if you have a food or a medicine or a toy or an aircraft, most recently, which there is public concern about in terms of its safety, what happens is it's withdrawn from the market, They do testing, they try to get it right, and then they release it again. We're not quite there yet. I don't know why, but with digital technologies, but I think that's where we're going to be. I think that's where we're heading.
Okay, Guillermo, and then
I was
Toro.
just going to draw a similar analogy
Okay.
in the sense that would we accept that race to the bottom or that low threshold if we were talking about our own health? Like, would we accept living in a continent as here in Europe that we don't know what we're going to find in the supermarket or what the impact on our health is? I think the answer is obviously not. And just having those safeguards at a certain level also for new technologies, whether it's with an ex post market analysis and withdrawal, or whether it's sometimes even with ex ante human right impact assessments, which is something that we advocate for, is going to be crucial.
But is, as Christian said, this religion of convenience not the virus that infects pretty much all of us, in the same way that you could have sugar in the food? It's a long-term consequence that you don't appreciate when you're standing in the supermarket. Is this slow burn the real risk for our society?
There is that risk as well, which is why it's so fundamental that we have these conversations. And coming to your very first question on Christian's point on whether should we have the debate about do we actually want this technology, I think we shouldn't be asking ourselves that question. Of course we have to ask ourselves Christian's question. I think that would be a measure of the healthiness of our own society.
Toro?
I just wanted to make sure that we're not under-addressing one point, and that is the global perspective on things, because others like China and the United States, or the companies operating there, are way more advanced than the companies operating in Europe. And let's be realistic about it, in a few decades, those who control the technology and the artificial intelligence will be in position to control the whole world and impose their rules onto the others. We have to, Europeans can take the lead and try, and I'm not going to be a bit provocative here, and I am not necessarily going to tell you what you want to hear, but we have to be realistic about some of the issues. And Europe can try to take the lead with its GDPR, but that doesn't mean it is in position to impose its rules and regulations, no matter how optimistic we are, onto other international actors, as long as it is behind them. You can do that if you are ahead of them. We are not ahead of them. We are behind them. Okay. And the Chinese, they have their own version of the GDPR. Since 2009, they have some sort of data protection rules. But of course, as another speaker said, that applies more to the private companies, not to the public sector, who can be way advanced. But the level at which they are is, to give you an example, that they experiment making payments with facial recognition in some of the shops. That's the level.
Well, not even just the shops. There's a really excellent series I recommend to you. I'm going to get some comments from Joris and open to the floor. So, Hello World by Bloomberg at the moment. They have a series on AI, and one element, the reporter goes to Shenzhen, and they talk to Western, particularly Australian tech specialists living and working there. And they ask what it's like, and says it's fine, it's not a big deal, it's not a dystopian society. Like you say, this is not a big bad place. It's a very complex society. But then he gave an immediate example. He was walking across the road, and by the time he got to the other side of the road, his phone sent him a notification that he'd been fined for jaywalking, and the money had been deducted from his account by the time he had crossed the other side of the road, because in that city, the facial recognition system was so strong. Any comments on this before we open up to the floor? Okay. Cornelia.
Maybe just one. So first of all, I think there is a bit of an agreement that we need to have a regulatory floor.
Yes.
So that we don't have this race to the bottom. On this particular point, I think there is spaces like the private sphere and what that really means for society. I think that is precisely where eventually our society is just distinctively different here in Europe from how Chinese society works and understands itself. And we have researchers in Microsoft that have actually done some of that research specifically in funny enough, they were looking at China, Germany, and the US specifically, in how distinct the approaches to privacy are. And since I'm German, I could totally relate to the German way of thinking. It's fine as long as the government is as it is, and this is sort of a historical...
Trustworthy.
As long as the government is trustworthy and follows rule of law. And I think there we have work to be done, and that goes back to this. We need to advocate for systems in which there is no room for a surveillance state.
Okay. Just to follow on that, coming from Ireland, there's a study in Ireland as well. So to open up, and this is where I see the political risk, to open up the way for AI and surveillance by the state. They used a search for a particular sex offender who had killed in the UK. And it's very hard to resist the argument that you shouldn't use AI and facial recognition because there's clearly a risk to children in society or anybody else. And so you end up with this mission creep, and that it's always back to, but I'm a good citizen, I have nothing to fear. You're a good citizen, clearly you have nothing to fear. So and I really see the separation between the state and the consumer side, the corporate side in this as well. So let's take some questions from the floor. Maybe you want to touch on this? John, get a microphone for Mr. Frank here.
I'd like to start with just a real life situation that I think most people in the room experience, which is when we go to the Brussels airport. After the terrorist attacks, they've reconfigured the airport, so we all walk in. I think there's probably 2 entrances that you can go through. And there's a camera there. Now, I'm assuming that camera is both videotaping what's there, but it's also matching, looking to see if somebody's on a watch list. How do you feel about that? I assume they're doing it in compliance with the police data protection law as well as general protection laws. Do you feel okay about that?
Doro?
I don't mind.
Christian?
I'm not so troubled about it because I know that it's within a context where there are controls, and there are people that you can go to if you think it's abusive.
Okay. Guillermo?
I focus on the final assumption. We assume that they are compliant with laws that we still don't know whether they are ready for this technology. So would those all assumptions be true, then as long as it's for a very limited use and with a certain series of safeguards, then that use case could possibly work.
Cornelia?
A lot of assumptions, but in the specific case, the Belgium government raised its alert levels to the highest point for a couple of months, and it goes back to this point. So if they have a specific identified person they are actually looking after, so the identification is it's an identification for a specific case, not a general without purpose surveillance.
Or a specific set of cases as a watch list.
Or that. And now you go to the next step. It cannot be the only tool. So you have mechanisms, so you have an identification, but you need to make sure that there is no false positives in order not to entail the wrong people. And then you need to also have a process in place, and what are you doing actually with the images that you have captured.
Sure.
And so if those governance specific points are met, I think it's a useful
Okay, because in this situation, as this system advances, the AI will be able to determine association as well, and not just match police records, but every scenario that you've been through.
Technology is capable of lots of things. The point is, how is it deployed?
Okay.
Right?
Yeah,
Joris answer this, and I'll go to the others.
I think it's a really great question, and there's a lot to say about that. So John Frank is super expert in this area, and so you I guess have reasonable assumptions of the things that happen, and have also expertise about the regulatory frameworks that are in place, and these factors, they shape how you relate to what is happening. So I think most people that are confronted nowadays with cameras, they do not have the expertise. They do not have the expertise about what the technology is doing, and they do not have the expertise about the regulatory framework. So how are they going to relate to things becoming smarter and smarter? So this is a real challenge for smart technologies, where if things become smarter around the world, people start to become paranoia about things being smart that actually are not smart. So there are these anecdotes about people seeing a billboard, and then it's showing an advertisement about something that they dreamed about, and they think it's connected to to their dreams. I'm not joking. These things are real. So this is really about the point where these smart technologies are having behavioral impacts on our society.
What was
at
it
the
you
individual
dreamt
level?
about?
And
What was it you dreamt about that appeared on the
no, it
billboard?
was not my. This is not my anecdote. These are but these are things that come up in research, and if you start asking people about it, and it's like some people are very advanced in their understanding of some of these technologies. For instance, because they are dealing with it in the workplace, they have facial recognition system in the workplace. They have been explained very well. So if they come into an airport where some of these things happen, they have some frame of reference. It could be wrong, but it could be right, you know. And so it's really there the point where at least a certain amount of transparency that is effective with respect to the general population is incredibly important, you know. And then to have these kind of broader discussion with the population. It's not something that we can leave to experts, you know, to be confident that things are organized well, because people are going to go to all sorts of places with the way that they relate to these kind of things.
Okay, thank you. This gentleman here, and then the lady here as well, and then over there too.
Thanks very much.
Just tell us where you're from first.
Yeah, so Eugene McQuaid from Fresh Shields Law Firm. I want to just pick up on the facial recognition point. I mean, with these technologies, essentially what we're looking to do is solve problems. And so if we take, for example, the problem of someone who's blind not being able to recognize the emotions of someone else, then that is a specific use case, and the technology is used to solve a specific problem. So I can see that companies in Europe are wanting to develop these solutions, and we have also clients that want to do that too. My question then to the panel is, what's the best way for Europe to promote that? You know, if we have the regulatory framework that it's the GDPR, a lot of these companies will be developing the solution with the use case in mind, but also aware of the penalties the GDPR carries with it. So for them to be able to develop the software or technology in a way that is both compliant but also satisfies the use case. And so kind of, is there perhaps with a sandbox system, or to be able to properly kind of talk to the regulator before it gets kind of actually piloted? So just what's the kind of the best way that as Europe we can kind of encourage these?
We didn't talk about voice recognition, but from Eugene's accent, I can tell he's from the 10-mile radius where I'm from as well. Panel, who wants to go first?
Just quickly, since you are a lawyer, I assume you already know that there are many companies who still have to figure out how to comply with the GDPR, which also gives you work to do. So I think that we first have to take stock of that and to give some time for that GDPR to see how it behaves before coming up with something on top of that and making things even more complicated.
But should we really wait? Do we have time to wait to see how GDPR pans out?
Well, you know, with any piece of regulation, you have to give it time to see how it impacts the actual society. And again, many companies have to figure out, because they may make mistakes without knowing that they are legal mistakes. Okay. I have to insist on this, we certainly don't want to hamper the European companies any further.
Okay, just some quick answers and we'll take another question then. Christian, anything on this?
Well, the GDPR is a sort of trifecta. You can imagine it as there's three things. There's people who are getting value from using the data. Those are the data controllers, usually the companies and the public bodies, and they have certain obligations. So they're accountable. They need to go through a process. They think, well, okay, it's technologically possible. We can probably, with some brilliant lawyers like yourself, argue that it's legally compliant. But is it ethically sustainable? Is it something which is which we can take responsibility for when something goes wrong? The second part is the ordinary people, and that's where consent comes in. But also being able to understand, as Joris was saying, understand what's actually going on. And then the third is the recourse mechanism. So is there an independent body that you can turn to, including the courts, when something goes wrong?
Okay, thank you, Guillermo.
So you see, all those very pertinent questions, which I agree with Christian, apply not just to AI, but also to lower tech things that we already have today. So there's the same questions apply to the Internet of Things or to a bunch of connected objects, where we have a myriad of potential legislation that could apply, agencies that could intervene, but it's not very clear for regulators, let alone for normal citizens, how this all operates. And that is key also in an AI context, because the other concern I would add to the example that John brought is that what if something goes wrong, who's responsible? So we haven't figured out also that responsibility and liability question.
Cornelia.
Yeah, and I've mentioned the transparency note that we have developed for our customers to use, and just to give you 3 points that it advises our customers to develop, which is how do you deploy responsible facial recognition systems, evaluate stakeholder concerns, and design the experience to address them, develop transparent communication and escalation processes for stakeholder concerns, provide training and evaluate the effectiveness of people who make final judgments based on facial recognition, update privacy policies, and implement necessary changes. So this is just a part of the transparency note that we have just recently published for the users of our Face API to deploy. So I think it's a lot about the governance, which starts with the governance that is prescripted by GDPR, but it goes really further than that.
Thank you, Joris.
No, I think it's clear that there's value in regulatory guidance in this space. There's a lot of questions like to what extent does the GDPR tackle certain things, and to what extent doesn't it, and do we need other frameworks to look at? So I expect we'll see something in that area, but I think there's a clear value for that. The second thing that was my bias, but I think for helping to create a very robust societal discussion, independent academic research is of course incredibly valuable and important. You know, it can these types of social behaviors and the impacts of technologies, developing new regulatory and normative approaches to new technologies, and just studying the landscape and being there to inform policymakers, to engage with other stakeholders. So that's I think that's something that also stands out. It's a bit longer term.
Yeah.
Now it's a little bit more like, okay, that needs to happen. That's an investment that pays off on a different time scale than the kind of time scale that you're working on with your clients. But I think it's also very important.
Okay, who's going to take a question from the lady here in just a second. I just want to show of hands for a second. Very simple question, emotional response, don't think too much about it. Who here is comfortable with AI and facial recognition? Raise your hand. No, just very broad question. Deliberately so. Who's not comfortable with AI and facial recognition? Easily more. Okay. Just tell us who you are, where you're from.
Martin Lapierre from Federal Police, so I'm
okay, great.
Biometric expert. I have a question, but I also want to make a remark on, on the earlier, because I think the statement with the camera and the automatic the watch list is not really correct. I think it was a purpose, like a private trial to make such a thing, but to my knowledge it is not operational. So, and it is not from the police.
Okay, but theoretically it's possible.
But theoretically it's possible. But these are things we are discussing, and as a matter of fact, a watch list is not legal allowed. I mean, it's the opinion of the police that we cannot go for watch list because in the processing of the biometrics, we cannot make subgroups or just look at some people, special things.
Generally, is this a sensitive discussion in, not asking about your organization, but in law enforcement in general? Is this a very sensitive discussion? Are people only beginning to discuss this now?
No, it's very sensible. Also, in all projects we are doing, we have to take very much care not to infringe this.
And where does the instruction come? Does it come from your internal lawyers? Does it come from the police? Does it come from politicians that this must be handled with real care?
We have our lawyers, yes, we have our lawyers, and you have a lot of European regulations, of course. So we have to follow all this very carefully.
Thank you. Yeah. You have a question for the panel as well?
And I have a question on this, and it's more like a remark and question, because I think it's interesting to think, I see AI enabled and facial recognition. We're talking about facial recognition, not on biometrics in general. Why is facial recognition now in the question of this? Because I think earlier the recognition, the accuracy was so bad that people thought it was not important to think of the privacy issues, and so this has been changed, and we see in regulation, in European regulation, like for the passport control, the European passport, it is. The idea is that the fingerprints are much more sensitive information than the faces. So why you cannot simply read the fingerprints, but you can read the facial images. Although, if I have a fingerprint of you and I publish this, I cannot do anything with it. But
That's
if I public your face, I mean, it is much more privacy infringement than the fingerprint. So we should think about this. And of course, as long as the recognition rate is low, is no problem. But nowadays, where we are really getting these 99 points.
Okay. Who wants to respond to this? Thank you very much. Cornelia, then Christian.
So one of the distinctions, I think, is the way that facial recognition can be deployed, because fingerprints are still when you give your fingerprints, you're still there, but your facial recognition, you can actually be identified from very, very far away in masses of people, and I think that makes the distinction between other biometrics. Now under GDPR, they are treated the same way, of course.
Yes.
And so.
It's true. Okay. You're there, you're physically present as well. Christian.
If you distinguish between AI and facial recognition, I probably would have kept my hand down for the first and raised my hand for the second. The reason for that is there's something unique about your face. I mean, nobody has a face like you. It's extremely personal.
Say that as though it's an insult.
And it can't change. Fingerprints. Well, it's interesting. In India, one of the I don't know if you remember a couple of years ago, very controversial. They withdrew the largest currency notes, ostensibly to try to combat organised crime, but it basically. It penalised a lot of the most poor people because they do manual work. Their fingers had been so worn down. So I mean, there's something very unique about your face, and when you have something that is constantly on, constantly monitoring, you can't opt out. I mean, in the GDPR, you should opt in before you even have a valid legal basis. But if you can't opt out at all, then there is a serious long-term ethical question for that.
Okay. We're going to have another 5 minutes, so let's do... Joris wants to respond, then we'll take another question.
I think the question really shows how complex the space is, I'm not gonna speak another PhD here, and try to distinguish all these kind of things, but even within an airport, there are lots of things going on there. So there could be part of it is that there's some kind of public order, security in a general sense, and so that could be a purpose of using some of these technologies, using some kind of abnormal behavior detection. It could be seeing aggression or detecting kind of abnormal movement patterns. If it's just about the flow, it could be just about the flow.
Any
in the
family
airport
with kids in
so many people.
Abnormal behavior.
And then, but the technologies are used in public spaces for that, for crowd control purposes and things like that. And then it is you have various stages in the airport where different things are going on. There's a security check. There's maybe things related to border crossing, which is different. It's not about the stuff that you have. So, and there, you can see in all these different stages, you could see some forms of facial recognition and AI being implemented. Yeah.
Okay, let's group a few questions together. Just if you get a couple of microphones, tell us your question quickly, and the panel can respond as they please.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm Frederik de Bakker. I work for Telefonica. I have a quick question, perhaps for Joris. So I would imagine that there is a difference, perhaps when you are in different places. And I don't know if there is a legal basis. I mean, in the airport, there might be a kind of expectation that you will be identified, because at the end of the day, you have to embark and something like that. But I don't know if you can elaborate on that point, because I mean, there are probably a lot of spaces where we do not expect to be identified. And
okay, so reasonable expectation. Next
Yeah.
person. We've got a microphone here, please. Then we'll go over there. Thank you. Just tell us who you are, where you're from, please.
Thank you. I'm Agnieszka Jerzewicz from Poland. I'm here as an independent expert for the European Commission. And I would like to ask you for anti-discriminatory nature of the design and the use of the facial recognition technology. What mechanisms do you think could ensure such nature?
Okay.
And
Sure.
I would like to add two facts for the context for this question. Recently, it was reported by BBC that several UK police forces they have been trialing the facial recognition technology, which did not test it racial, or it wasn't tested against racial or ethnic discrimination. The other issue is that just recently European Parliament has adopted a resolution against, or resolution for fundamental rights of African people in Europe. And it was stated in that resolution that people of African descent in Europe are overwhelmingly underrepresented at the European level, in the political and lawmaking institutions. Now, if we focus on the high-level group for AI, we cannot find any person of an African descent in this body. So
can we trust the expert group to deliver a fair analysis of bias?
Thank you.
Thank you. Two more, and then we're going to put these to the panel. One over here.
Yeah, thank you. Hager Basuni, I'm from Hazelberg, but I'm here in my personal capacity.
Sure.
So I raised my hand when you said who is for AI-enabled facial recognition, mostly because I'm born in Egypt, but I have a Dutch passport. So going through the AI facial recognition scan is easier for me than the second degree I get from the customs borders, as it were. And just following on from the lady from Poland, that was indeed the question that I was getting towards, because I lived in the UK as well, and there you have CCTV. And now they're running the automated facial recognition trial as well. And the question is, well, what is the actual difference between someone watching you on CCTV and knowing you're watched, and someone and a machine, an automated facial recognition, picking you out of a crowd if there's a necessity for it? Going back to the story of Egypt, for example, the revolution there, I would have appreciated AI-enabled facial recognition to pick out the people who were starting the fights in the crowd, as opposed to 800 innocent people being picked up. So maybe that's another dimension to look at. We're discussing the European dimension maybe too much here, so let's focus globally as well.
I wouldn't say the two are going to be mutually exclusive in the future. Gentleman here, and then I'll take yours, and then we have to close up.
So I was thinking about forbidding the data. For example, let's say in the future somebody says they can choose, I want my face not to be recognized. So for example, if I walk a red light, I will not be fined. But for example, in the future, let's say there is also another technology that if it keeps tracking your face under different conditions, it can detect, I don't know, you will have cancer. But because you disable that technology, you will not get that and maybe die because of that. Can people be able to live with that consequences? We will have to remind them.
Well, in that case, they wouldn't.
If you don't enable this, you will lose this and gain this. Can people handle that in the future?
Opting out of life. AI. Last one, and then go to round up. Thank you. There we go.
Thank you. Paul Jacinto, Cirrus Global. There's a 20% mismatch probability when trying to match a face to a photograph.
It's better than Tinder, though, isn't it?
I'm sorry?
20% mismatch is better than Tinder.
20% mismatch probability, right, when trying to match a face to a photograph. And that number rises proportionally when trying to match a face of someone of a different racial identity. So the question is it ethically correct to put facial recognition software, which is more accurate at border control points, at all border control points. So people may be trying to, smugglers, traffickers, terrorists, so on and so forth, who are trying to enter a country, they don't go to a border control point that does not have that software as opposed to one that does.
Thank you. PNR had a similar kind of issue. You could choose your airport if you wanted to get into Europe in a hurry. Okay, let's summarize these and you can tell me which ones you want to respond to. So the expectation, reasonable expectation of identification, the airport scenario, you know, one thing to be identified at the airport, another to be the supermarket. Then we have the racial bias, inherent bias, and oversight of bias. And then also a universal application of this system in Europe, if we can put it that way as well. Comments? And this is our final round. Doro.
Yeah, I would like to address the anti-discrimination question because, of course, that's one of the main concerns of the use of it, to make sure that this machine do not end up with discrimination. And of course, the other speakers will talk about the regulations that are needed in order to prevent this from happening. But I would say that beyond the regulatory side of it, I think the best way to prevent this or to limit this is to make sure that the citizens themselves are properly educated in understanding how these machines work, while at the so that they can make the difference between when there is a danger that their rights are breached, while not becoming too paranoid either. So it's very important to keep them in this at the right point within this balance. And so that's one, have them educated, but they also have to have access to the mechanisms that these machines are using. So I think the transparency of these mechanisms is also highly important, so that we know how they work, how they code it, and as much as possible for citizens to be able to check them. Of course, not every citizen will be able to do so, so that's why the role of the citizens organizations will become fundamental.
Thank you. Christian.
Yeah, I'll try just to touch on each of those in one answer. As someone who's half Indian, I agree. It's lamentable that there are never any faces of colour in meetings that I attend in Brussels. There's a scholar called Joy Buruamwini, based in MIT, who's done some phenomenal work exposing the bias within existing AI systems, the way that they exclude women, and particularly women of colour. So you're never actually going to have. You're never going to eliminate bias. That's a fact. You can never completely eliminate bias. There'll always be edge data and exceptions. But even if you were to be able to eliminate bias, you would not succeed in ensuring all technology is fair. And the reason for that is because the technology sits on structures of inequality and uneven distribution of power. One of the judges of the European Court of Justice recently said at a speech in his first sentence, data means power. So what we're actually looking at with all of this technology, and for all of these important cases that people are raising on borders and in the work of the police, etc., is how can you use technology in a way that's actually going to empower people and not entrench inequalities and unfair treatment of the vulnerable. Because my last point, the people, and Guillermo referred to this earlier, the people who are most subject to technology today, objects of technology, the most vulnerable, it's children, it's migrants, it's low-paid workers working in warehouses, it's people of colour who are assumed to be criminals or not even on the system. So that's the big societal challenge.
Thank you. Guillermo.
So just the Frederick's question made me think different expectation at different places, that one of the things we need to be able to have is a framework that allows the explainability of the technology, so a way for users to be aware of what is going on. But just maybe, we don't have time to debate, but maybe to contest a little bit what you were saying about user awareness being an important step here, sure, but like I would challenge how many of us really understand how our smartphone works, or any given app, what's happening behind any given app today. And that's a simple technology. So just imagine in the future. So I think the question I wanted to touch most on is the anti-discrimination question, because I find it a very important one. And the Council of Europe just very recently issued some guidelines on how to protect human rights in the era of artificial technology. And some of the things it says, and we also agree with, is that when we're talking about artificial intelligence, facial recognition technology deployed by public authorities, there should be a framework that mandates those public authorities to do a human rights impact assessment beforehand. And that impact assessment should include an independent external review. And then we need an ex post check as well. So we need to both ask ourselves beforehand, do we already have a discriminatory situation that we may be making worse? Are we going to be making it better, etc.? Or what is the context in which we're deploying this technology? And then have very clear mechanisms to evaluate how the technology is working after that.
Thank you. Cornelia.
Yeah, so what is nice, and despite the bigger question that was asked is, should we use it at all? I think there has been a lot of suggestions actually in the path forward. The one, and I've mentioned a couple of tools already, and they're very much aligned with what Guillermo was just saying. The one thing that we are driving for in this space is also diversity, not only in the data, but also in the workforce, in order to ensure that when these techniques are developed, that it reflects really the broader the broader society. So it needs to be reflected also in those who develop that. I mentioned also the data sheets for data sets, the documentation, which is really required in order to assess whether this specific AI tool is adapt for the specific use that you wanted to have for that can be developed. And then I think we need to really go back to the point that these technologies shall augment human decisions and not necessarily replace them. So that is an important tool as well. And if I may just, the one last point, I want to sort of challenge those who have raised their hand, whether they are comfortable with using facial recognition. I might be wrong, but I sort of believe that most of you probably already use it with your iPhones when instead of using a PIN code, or with your banking account instead of using a PIN code. So we are actually using these technologies quite often already.
Okay, thank you, Joris.
I like the point about the reasonable expectations, but I want to speak to the anti-discrimination questions in particular. So I've done a bit of work in this area. What you see is that the anti-discrimination groups in Europe, they're not included in tech policy debates. You know, like that's a real issue. You know, like and we see in the US much more people of color being actually raising their voices, more activist groups being included in discussions. We lack that representation in Europe, and we really need to address that. Partly because discrimination, structural racism, and increased violence also against migrants, Muslim communities, people of African descent. It's a really big problem at the moment in European society. So then, like in this area, I think a concern that we should all have is that there's really over-representation of black and brown people in government databases. You know, partly because some of these databases, they can already be set up with the purpose of dealing with particular issues of migrant groups. You know, so we have really there in the government database space, we really have some issues that with the representation of data, also bias in existing data sets because of like the way that policing operates. And then finally, it's a real challenge to get regulators, to get governments to accept that there are these problems. I think the mainstream in Europe is still like things should be colorblind, and there's really a resistance also to start monitoring on some of these issues. Like if you look at the racial profiling by the police kind of work, where activist group for a long time have tried to get police, to at least register, when they stop people and like ask them questions, or like to do some monitoring on is there racial bias there? But there's a lot of resistance to even register this kind of data. You know, so it's really there's a number of really big challenges. You know, like for Europe to start to address these discrimination issues in the context of AI effectively. So a lot of work there.
Just before we thank our panel, John, a few words.
I'd like to thank everybody for coming out tonight. The discussion, is there more than just an ethics? I think the answer we intended was obviously yes. There's a lot more, and greatly appreciate everybody's participation, a lot of questions. And after we thank the panel, we've got some refreshments outside where we can continue the conversation.
Thank you. So thank you to our excellent team. Thank you also to John Frank and the Microsoft team, and to your active crew and our audiovisual team as well. Please join us outside. Thank you for coming.